Hello and welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman and I'm excited to be your guide for this AZ500 Microsoft Azure Security Technologies. We're in a learning path for securing identity and access, and specifically in the first module, we're going to take a look at the configuration of an identity and the access controls that are available to you using Microsoft Entra ID. Through this recording, as well as all the recordings in this series, you may want to follow along with the corresponding course material that's available at that short link of aka.ms/course AZ-500. There's going to be a lot more information in that material that is going to go more in depth and in specifically how to configure some of the features that we're just going to talk about from a security perspective and what value it has to you as a security engineer and why you may want to use it. I'm just going to go off to there for a minute so that you can see it and then possibly follow along as you watch these recordings. So if you go to the short link, aka.ms/course AZ-500, you should land on this page on the Microsoft Learn site. In here are the 4 learning paths that make up the entirety of this course. I'm going to go into the first learning path on identity and access, and you'll see that we have the 2 modules, the managing security controls and identity, and this is where we're going to spend this recording going through these topics. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to start working at the Microsoft Benchmark Identity Management, and you'll see that I'm not going to go through the many pages of information about all the identity controls that are available through the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, but I will be making reference to them. So if you're following along in the content, you'll be able to actually see more depth and more information around that topic. So the goal of this course is to give you some background in what Microsoft Entra ID is as the current identity provider available in Microsoft Azure. We'll take a look at what the identities are and what the management controls are, specifically from a security perspective, and why you might want to implement one service versus another based around a logical decision of what works best for your organization from an ease of use, management, as well as security features. We're then going to go off and take a look at another module. We'll take a look at the management of those identities, but let's get into this. Before I start the specific content, it's better to have an overall understanding of the infrastructure of Azure and some terms that are going to be referenced throughout this. Now, when you take a look on the right-hand side of the screen, you see at the very top, we start with public Azure. In fact, we have multiple versions of Azure, whether it be in what's called a sovereign cloud or on an on-premises location. But you want to understand this term called scopes, because a lot of the security and the controls that you're going to implement are going to be done to a specific scope. And you'll see us talk about it specifically in this module, as well as throughout this course series. Inside of public Azure, we have over 68 regions globally making all the Azure resources available in a geographic location. And you can use some or all of them if you want it. So it's important to understand that this is a global resource. Your first entry into that space is called a tenant, and that's that box below that dark black line down from the top. So everybody has a thing called a tenant inside of Azure. Even Microsoft, as a customer of our own product, is Microsoft.onmicrosoft.com. And you'll see that as I go into a specific focus on that one box. A tenant has a tenant ID, which you'll see in that box, and you'll see the tenant name as something.onmicrosoft.com, and then you have a name that goes along with this, and this is going to be based around if you're able to validate a public namespace that you might own, say a .com or a .edu or a .org or whatever the name might be. If you can prove that you own that namespace, you could use that as a replacement to the tenant name that you're automatically going to get as something.onmicrosoft.com. So your tenant. Let's take a look at the other parts of the scope. Inside of your tenant, you're seeing 2 boxes, one on the left-hand side that talks about resource management. We're going to get to those parts a little bit later on, but we're going to spend a lot of this module dealing with the identity management piece on the right-hand side. So once you create a tenant and you then purchase a subscription or populate a subscription inside of your tenant, you're going to then get a directory service with that tenant. Now, people use these terms interchangeably. Microsoft documentation is sometimes vague on it, but I'm going to be very clear. Your tenant is where you create that entity for a directory service. Now, there's a one-to-one relationship between the directory service of your tenant and the tenant. Now, technically, it's referred to as the tenant directory, but people call it the tenant. And so it's, when do you say a lie enough that it becomes the truth? It's not the tenant, it's the tenant directory, and that's your identity management. And its current name at the time of this recording is referred to as Microsoft Entra ID. On the left-hand side, you now see that we have the ability to start populating a series of resources that you're working with as our scopes. You're also seeing a small example on that right-hand side of other domain names that you might be able to register inside of your tenant directory, and then using potentially one of those for your tenant name. So what we now have, and we're going to get into this in this module in the course, we then have other scopes at the very top of your tenant. So the tenant is the entry point into your Azure space. Below that, you get a thing called a tenant root management group. And there's one level, you can change its name if you want. And below the tenant root management group, you have the ability to organizationally structure your use of Azure using 10,000 management groups in a structured order of 6 additional levels that you can add below that tenant root management group. So you could replicate whatever organizational structure you want. These become the scopes that we want to manage inside of Azure. We flow things down, and as a general rule throughout this entire series of this recording, we want to understand how things flow. And as a general rule, child objects inherit things from their parent object. So a child management group inherits something from its parent management group. You'll see that a subscription is below a management group, and we'll show you in this module that where you can deploy a subscription into a management group and not other management groups, it inherits things from its management group that it's a part of. You'll see that resource groups, which are billed to a subscription, inherit things from their subscription, which inherited things from its management group, which came from the tenant root management group, and so on. So that hierarchical structure of inheriting things, now whether it be a billing construct, whether it be things called policies that we'll cover in another part of the recording, whether it be permissions, all of these things potentially inherit from a parent object or are explicitly assigned. Just from a context perspective, again, I want to explain a couple of terms that people use interchangeably, and I want to make sure that we have a definition of them. Now, those top two on the left, identity and security principles, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, but I've given you the definition of what they are. They're kind of the same, but they are slightly different. But in our definition or our conversation in this recording and other recordings, we're going to talk about them as if they were the same. So an identity or a security principle is a general term describing a broad range of potential identities that we have. Below that, you're starting to see another level. You see that we have user principles and service principles. So you can see some confusion, security principle versus a service principle. A service principle is a security principle or an identity. Now below that, that's where we're going to get into the course. We're going to take a look at users. We're going to take a look at groups. We're going to look at devices as different types of user principles. On that right-hand side, service principles, we will get into the recording, and we're going to take a look at things like managed identities, whether they be user-assigned or system-assigned managed identities. We're going to take a look at applications as a service principle. And so I want to make sure that you're familiar with those names and use them correctly where they fit into the hierarchy of naming and objects that we're going to be able to create. So now let's get into the content. This module is going to cover managing security controls around that identity and the access control that it's going to provide. Now, all of this course is going to be in reference to the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, or that MCSB, security controls that you can use for identity management and privileged access. There is a whole variety. If you went to the course content that I gave you that link to, you'll see that at the start of every one of these modules that we record, they make a reference to the identity management and privileged access controls that were defined for that recording session and the objects that you're going to be able to control. So know that everything that's in here, all these topics, we're going to show you what it is and why you might want to use it as an object, but know that the controls that you can put around that object's use can be managed using either Microsoft Sentinel or Microsoft Defender for Cloud as ways to enforce governance into your tenant's use of those resources. So you're hearing some of those language objects that we're dealing with. So I'm not going to go through all of the identity management principles. They're listed for you in the course content, but know that every topic that I'm covering and everything I say about that topic, you could actually monitor, audit the use of that identity that way, and make sure that it falls in line with some governance control that you might want to have around that object. So specifically, starting off with Microsoft Entra ID is the new modern authentication protocol system that's available in Microsoft Azure. It is that tenant directory, and there's that one-to-one relationship that you have a tenant that has a directory, that directory is associated with that tenant. Now, as a general rule, Microsoft recommends that you have a single tenant with a single directory for most organizations. With the use of management groups, which we'll cover in a bit, there can actually organizationally structure to the largest organizations on the planet. Now, there are reasons, we're not going to get into them in this class, to create multiple tenants if you're working, if you have a need for that security governance to be in a different plane, because that's how really we separate the tenants themselves. Remember, child objects inherit things from their parent, and everything comes down from the tenant itself. The management groups and the subscriptions, all that identity control, the identities themselves come from the tenant. Now, if you need to be able to separate either your directory structures for your tenant or the resource management, you might want to have multiple tenants, and that creates a different governance plane that you want to work with. Now, we'll also show you in this lesson how you might be able to manage that as a single plane, but typically they are different management planes. So Microsoft Entra ID is your entry point into this that you can now license and then manage all of your users, regardless how simple or complex your organization might be. We theoretically could manage all of those needs and requirements using Microsoft Entra ID as that place to do that identity management that provides both authentication and authorization. Two words that sound the same, but are different parts of a whole piece. Authentication is proving who you are. And we're going to take a look in this recording, the different protocols that are used. Once you've authenticated who you are, the authorization is going to be granting you the capability to perform some activity. And so we're going to take a look at those two parts as a whole as part of this recording that we'll go through. The obvious choice we start with is users. And that becomes, remember we talked about user principles as an identity. We have different types of users. And in the past, this was a fairly simple process. If you go back to your on-premises world using products like Active Directory Domain Services, you maybe had a forest that you had different domain controllers and your users existed in there. This is very similar, but the fundamental concept of the user is the same, but the technologies around that user are going to be slightly different. I'm going to mention these terms now, but know that we'll cover them in depth in a few minutes. A user, in the reference to an Active Directory domain service, that on-premises user that you've probably been used to for a long time, is based around an identity that's based on Kerberos and NTLM, some legacy technologies that have been around for decades, and they've served us very well. But as we've moved to the cloud, we now have still identities and we still have users, but they are fundamentally based on a different set of technologies. And Azure, and specifically Entra ID, are based on OpenID, OData, OAuth, and WSFed. These are the technologies that take this modern identity and fix some of the issues that we had around the old on-premises identities with NTLM and Kerberos. So users are still at the heart of this, and it provides that fine-grained, granular control to grant something to a specific user. Now, as much as users are a great place to start, we have a wide variety of different users that we can now define inside of Azure and specifically Microsoft Entra ID. We have in the past, and I'll give an example, Bob as a Microsoft employee, I've had different roles. And in a past role, I used to go to customers. And as I showed up at the start of their building, or at the entry of the building, I had to verify who I was. I gave them my identity, showed them maybe my government issued identity, and they took that as validation that I am who I am. And they have a list that said Bob from Microsoft was coming. So they then would typically give me an envelope, said, hey, Bob, here's your identity that you're going to have for this duration of time that you're at our company. So in their identity provider, their on-premises ADDS, They created a user account for Bob at their company. They gave me a password. I might have changed that password. Maybe they thought it was super secret and they gave me an RSA token. And so now they thought that this is very secure. Now, I would often perform my activities and they had restricted me, gave me permissions to the resources I needed to do. But at the end of the week, when I finished, or the end of that project, I would give them back that envelope and said, hey, here's your token back. Can you please delete my account? And many times they would go, no, Bob, don't worry. You may come back. And I'm going, I ain't coming back. And I've got accounts that I haven't been at years that I can still log into them because they haven't disabled the account. They haven't deleted the account. That's an attack surface. There's an issue here. And so that's just talking about a story of that legacy-based environment. We got to get away from that. Enter ID provides the capability using these various types of users. Are you an internal user? Are you a guest user? Are you a user that's coming from another tenant? All of these different options now allows me to take the scenario that I just gave you and the attack surface that it presented to your organization. I could now say, hey, Bob from Microsoft is coming. And I'm not going to give Bob an account. I'm going to use Bob's Microsoft account that Bob would have to go to Microsoft's identity provider to prove that he was a Bob Tickleman at Microsoft. They authenticate them. I'm going to accept that as an authentication of that user. And then still my resources, I'm going to control the access to my resources by someone else's authentication that you're working with. And so that's a story that talks about these various different types of identities that you might want to have is, are you an internal user? Are you an invited user in? Are you a user coming from another tenant? Because I said at the start of this, there are reasons for companies to have multiple tenants. So you might have a company that you're part of the same company, but now you have multiple tenants. And how do we get our users to work back and forth across this governance boundary that the multi-tenant environment provides for us? So it really fundamentally changes your concept of what a user is, that you don't have to manage everything about that user and create those attack surfaces. So go through, read some of these backgrounds of the different types of users, but you really want to think about who's an internal user. They're my identity. I want to control them. Are they a guest user that's been invited in that I'm going to have, deprecated permissions that they have? Is it coming from another tenant that is maybe a partner company of ours, or is a partner company like Microsoft that their people are coming to us? Or is it from anybody inside of any Azure tenant? Or you'll see in a few minutes that we even have the ability to use third-party identities like a Gmail account or a Hotmail or MSN.com or Live.com or Outlook.com, the Microsoft public identities. So there's a wide variety to have these identities be different users from different realms that they're working with. Now, groups are groups. And you've probably had, if you worked with the ADDS environment, groups were there too, but we had different types of groups in Active Directory Domain Services on premises. And we had very strict rules about how they were used. We used to talk about universal groups and global groups and domain local groups and all the way that you could nest them together to create your structure you're dealing with. We don't have that level of complexity, at least not yet, inside of Azure. Groups are groups. They're kind of a flat level for all intents and purposes. And I'm going to make the case that you should never or rarely give access to somebody, a user, regardless of what kind of user they're at. You should not give that access to a user. You should give it access to a group. Because over the years that I've been doing this, I can absolutely guarantee you people change. The group that represents a service or a role in your organization changes infrequently. I'll give an example of HR. Maybe Bob is your HR manager and he needs access to thousands of objects. And so I've gone through and discreetly given Bob access to those thousands of objects. What happens if Bob gets a promotion and is no longer in that role, or Bob leaves the organization? I now have to take whoever filled that role and I now have to give them access to all the stuff that Bob had. Now imagine all the thousands of things you have to take Bob off and then put this new user in, when in fact, if you had an HR manager group, all you would need to do is to take the Bob user out and put this new user in, and they would automatically gain access to all the resources that group had been assigned. So just a small discussion talking about what it is, but think about the governance that goes along that. Who puts somebody in a group? How do they take them out? How long do they live in the group for? How do I audit all this? Because how many times have people put somebody in a group and somebody leaves, they don't get taken out of the group, but someone new gets added to it. But you got all these people in this group that do they still need to be in there? So we're going to take a look at, from a governance perspective, how do I manage some of these things? But just their use, hopefully it's given you a use case around. Now, how we grant access to things, and it's just I described, you can do it to the user specifically. You can put users into a group, and that's what you're seeing kind of going around in that counterclockwise rotation around that diagram that they have. How do I give someone else permissions to build the groups that you're working with? So a wide variety of different ways to do this, but you really want to use, and the term that we'll cover in a few slides is called RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control. And it is based around these three bubbles, and I'll draw it to you or for you when I get to that slide. But you really want to take a look at how you provide that granular control. And one of the nice things about Azure is it starts with what's called a zero trust model. And by default, no one has access to anything anywhere. And you open the system up. Now, you don't have to go deny people access. That's typically reserved for actually proving a rule. But just know that no one has access to anything. So if you create some users, by default, you created the user, but they can't do anything until you put them in a group or you give them some access to some resources, then they can start doing something. So take a look at that access management using the various identities that we have, whether they be user identities or group identities that we've just covered. Now, as the start of that conversation about RBAC, what you do is assign. You assign a user to a group possibly, and then you assign, the term is called rights there. I personally cringe when I hear that. Technically, in the security world, there's a difference between rights and permissions. This really isn't in the book, so I'd like to give that to you as kind of an extra piece. People use the terms rights and permissions interchangeably, and it's technically inaccurate. Like people will come to me, Bob, can I have the rights to do something? I'm going to go, no, not that I don't want to give it to you. It's over provisioning, because especially if, from an example of on-premises, rights and permissions have very similar features, but rights supersede permissions. So to access a file or a folder, all you need is maybe the read permission or the write permission. So you have a permission to that object that is discrete on that object. Now, a write, which is typically done through GPOs or group policy objects, is assigned to the individual on the system as a whole. So getting the right to do something, as opposed to a permission, which was granular, gives access to that right's use anywhere in the system that you have access to. And if there's ever a conflict between a right and a permission, rights supersede permission. And this is actually how some things are done from a security perspective or even backups. So for example, if I was working at a big pharmaceutical company, the $1 billion worth of drug research I don't have access to, but I can back it up. How does that happen? I don't have permissions to read the $1 billion worth of drug research and look at the files and the chemical formulas, but I can back it up as the backup operator. Because as a backup operator using backup software, I have the right to read every file on the system. Now that allows me to copy it to some backup media, and I can restore that. So I can copy it back to the location where it came from, because the permissions that go with it and protect the object, so I can't still read that information. Now I'm not going to get into all the potential security breaches of using rights at a deeper level, but really understand the difference between rights versus permissions. And this is the foundation using that term called an assignment. So you can see from that diagram starting in the upper right, you can actually grant somebody the permissions to actually add people to a group. You could add people to the group. And so they get assigned to the group and the group gets assigned, and they're missing a bubble in there for me. You're granting permissions to an object. In fact, you're going to grant them to a role, which is going to grant them the permissions they need to that object itself. Continuing our identity discussion, we have this broader range of identities that I've mentioned a little bit earlier. So we had that ability to have various types of users and groups inside of your system. We didn't cover it and don't cover it in this course, but devices are still objects like a user that have an identity that can be used and managed both in on-premises worlds as well as inside of Microsoft Entra ID. So you can actually have what are called domain joined or domain registered devices. Entra ID brings it from the on-premises world that you used to have only Windows-based devices that were domain joined. Now in the BYOD, or bring your own device world of user owned versus corporately owned devices, we have a broader range of devices that now can be managed under your Microsoft Entra ID. Not going to go too far into that because it's not covered here, but the other thing that we're taking a look at is that B2B collaboration. That goes back into the business to business. So you have your own tenant, and your identities are in there, and you can invite people in as guests to your tenant. Now, they still may be coming in, maybe using a personal email account that is now going to be associated with an ID that you have in your tenant, but it's really being authenticated by somebody else. In this business-to-business relationship, I'm going to give it, as my example I gave you of, Microsoft as a Microsoft employee authenticates me as I go to customers, and then they take that authentication as approved, and then they can grant me access to resources. So in that business-to-business relationship. And there's also a thing called a B2C, or business to consumer, that allows you to then use a broader range of public domain namespaces, as I said, like at Outlook.com, at MSN.com, that are public spaces that anybody can open up an identity for. Now, once you have an identity inside of Entra ID, we get a whole variety of identity protections. And we use this term somewhat or slightly differently throughout the different recordings. So I'm going to be really particular. This is going to be a Microsoft ID protection. And so there are by default 3 policies that you can put in place that are going to be used to protect the identities that you have inside of your Entra ID. And you're seeing an example of those 3 policies of, required password changes, or I need multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So you can create policies that are going to be there in place to protect the IDs that you're going to use and grant to people. Now, you could give it to everybody possibly, or maybe you have select users. Maybe they're elevated users. They are those researchers that have access to information. You want their identities to be protected a little bit more than maybe, some frontline, help desk people that might be widely available in your organization that don't have access to the secure information. So wide variety of reasons to use some of these, but we do have these different policies, and all of them can be part of that Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark that you can now monitor these identities that have these policies applied to them. How are they being used? Are they enforced? Are they being used properly? Are they causing problems? But again, we're trying to create a governance model that we could implement these services. It's not going to be my role to teach you how to do all of that. We have other courses, but you want to see that these are things that you can have around these identities that from a security and governance model, you might want to consider either asking for implementation to be done so you can govern it and report on it, or if you have more interest in doing it yourself, you could take the course to learn out how to do those specific components. Now, in your identity world, you're probably in what we refer to as a hybrid. You've got some stuff in the cloud, and maybe you still got some legacy stuff that's on premises. And it would sure be a lot of administration to have to deal with 2 identity providers. You've got your identity provider on premises, maybe with Active Directory domain services that you've been using for decades, and you now got this thing in the cloud. Using a feature called Entra Connect is a way to synchronize accounts between your on-premises world, that legacy identity provider that you have, and this new modern identity provider inside of Azure using Entra ID. I don't want to have to create 2 Bob accounts in both places, and then I have 2 different passwords. Now, they could be the same password, but they're 2 different passwords. And what happens if Bob goes away on vacation, comes back and forgets his password, and he does what's a feature called SSPR, or self-service password reset in the cloud, that allows me to reset my password in the cloud without having to call IT and get support. Well, that's great. It changes it in the cloud, but it didn't change it on premises. So now I go to on premises and try and use that identity. It goes, hey, that password doesn't work. You're going, what the heck? So using AD Connect as a way to tie together your environments to actually replicate information from on-premises to the cloud. Now, this can be done several different ways. Maybe I'll go back for just a second. The AD Connect, using a piece of software, will require you, as you see in the diagram, to configure or download this tool and create a connection between the on-premises world and the cloud world. Now, from a security perspective, you want to be very careful doing this. To set up that connection, you need to be what's referred to as an enterprise administrator on premises. To set up the other end of that connection, you need to be the global administrator inside of Azure and to connect to Entra ID, to create that connection, to copy objects from on-premises, usernames and passwords, and synchronize them to the cloud. So I still have two identities, and they look to be the same and with the same password, but it's being managed by a system that does that. Now, here's the potential problem. Those are high level, at the highest level in the organization. They also become two identities that we make a recommendation that you do not replicate through that connector. You do not want your on-premises enterprise admins to be global admins, and you don't want global admins to be enterprise admins inside of your on-premises world, because a compromise by one is a compromise of both environments. So that might be something you want to put in your governance model to make sure that only the authorized accounts are being replicated through this connector you're working with. I'm not going to get into all the other features yet, but the things you can do, as I said, just taking a look at this feature from a security perspective and what it means to you. Now, a little while ago, people said, gosh, it's not hard for us, but it's a lot of work to install this piece of software, manage the servers that it's on. We recommend you don't put it on domain controller. I've got to patch that server, and it has to be scaled based on the number of users. Let's say that, you got 50,000 users. Sounds like a lot for a lot of people, but we've got customers that have thousands and hundreds of thousands of accounts. And so you actually had to build server farms potentially to manage the throughput of that replication. A new feature, a relatively new feature that they provided, is this thing called a Cloud Sync service as a cloud-hosted capability to provide that synchronization feature. But for all intents and purposes, consider them as a functional perspective to be the same. But this one is much easier to configure, to set up, to scale, and to manage on an ongoing basis. Now, when you take a look at the different authentication options, I'm not going to go into this and drain the entire slide, but we have different features. And so my big takeaway from this is, if you can think of a security issue that you want to try and replicate, absolutely we can configure this. So let's go through this. I don't want to have two different accounts in two different locations with two different passwords managed that way. So using the AD Connect tool, I can now replicate information between my two identity providers. I can replicate the username and passwords and some other characteristics about that. Now, that feature is referred to in the top left as an password hash. So the usernames are the same and the passwords are the same between the two of them. Now, it's not a password, it's a hash of that password in the cloud. Now, there's lots of questions that some of you might go, well, yeah, but we've got that all covered. Do the research and find out about what the password hash synchronization does. So now I have two accounts that are two accounts with usernames and passwords that appear to be the same. Now, we have the capability in the cloud to do a feature called SSPR, Self-Service Password Reset, that many of you may not have on premises. Some of you might have got extra software that you've bought to do that for you. Great. But using the SSPR features, a user now could come to Azure, say I need to reset my password, and use the features of answering questions or provide a Microsoft Authenticator app to say, yes, I'm that person, I want to reset this password. But you can now synchronize what's called a write back or back to, and then take the password change on in the cloud and synchronize that password back to on-premises to keep the usernames and passwords synced. Now, the middle one there, the pass-through authentication, is going to now say, hey, listen, I don't mind replicating the username into the cloud, but I don't want the password to be replicated in the cloud. You could take the option to say, gosh, a user's come to me, but I don't have the password, so it's going to pass that authentication through back to the replication source, in this case on-premises ADDS, and it's going to authenticate you as the domain controller, pass it back to Entra ID, authenticate that user, and then pass that authentication off. And then maybe I don't even have the ID there. I just want to pass it through, and that's where you're going to get the federation version. And I'm taking it very simply here. There's a longer description, but I can now say, I'm going to take a user account that I don't know anything about and pass it off to authentication source that's been configured to say, hey, this user, I kind of know something about them. It comes from a domain that I know about, but I don't know what the user is or the password. I'm going to go off to this person I've been told that might be able to do that for me. And that's where you're going to get into this federation service itself. Microsoft Entra ID also provides a series of secure authentication processes. So whether you're going to use multi-factor authentication or MFA, you're going to use a thing like an authenticator app on your phone. These are features that are built in that you can now provide as a way to authenticate in the cloud, and then take that authentication and pass it back to your on-premises world. So it's a great way to elevate your authentication game, and you can now monitor and govern this using the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark values that you could then put in Windows Defender for Cloud or Microsoft Sentinel to monitor and govern the use of these features we're taking a look at. I've talked a couple of times about on-premises and that legacy technology. I've mentioned that in Azure we use OpenID, OData, OAuth, and WSFed. In the on-premises world, we use a technology called Kerberos, and on the next slide, we're going to take a look at NTLM. These are still legacy technologies that you may need to work with. So if I needed that, I could pass you through to the on-premises domain controller and get Kerberos. Entra ID does have a capability using an Entra Kerberos authentication process where you can now create a domain controller-like environment to grant that Kerberos authentication in addition to the OpenID authentication that you would get natively through Entra ID. So we do provide some of that backwards compatibility, and it can be engineered into your solution. And if it can be engineered in the solution, we could then monitor its process using features like Defender for Cloud. Another technology that is kind of a legacy-based, it is a legacy-based technology, NTLM, or the new technology capabilities that were on premises, and it really focused around non-domain type resources, what often were referred to as work groups. So NTLM and Kerberos were those legacy. We can still incorporate them as part of the solution, although that Entra ID itself cannot do natively these authentication methods, but we can work with them. When we start dealing with passwordless authentication as a higher level, instead of usernames and passwords, that becomes a weakness around social engineering and some of the challenges. MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is one of those capabilities. Am I going to send a text to your phone? Am I going to use an authenticator app? But we have other ways to have this passwordless authentication. On my laptop, I've got a camera that has a high resolution capability, and it actually does facial recognition that I can work with. So we've got a variety, you can see listed there. They talk about token capabilities that we have, certificates, authenticator apps, and facial recognitions or Windows Hello as ways to elevate. I can't tell you the last time I had to type my password in to log in and authenticate against Microsoft, because I'm using both my phone and my laptop. I'm using some form of MFA or facial recognition in Windows Hello on my device to do that passwordless feature. Another component that we take a look at, again, all part of the monitoring and governance features, is single sign-on. And so the ability to have an authentication used once across a variety of services. Now, this is slightly different than what you get by default in Entra, where every time you try and access something, it's not asking you to log back in, but it's taking that authentication process that you've already gotten, and then it's using that authentication across a variety of uses of it that you have. So single sign-on is a great capability that you may want to monitor and make sure that is not being compromised or used inappropriately across your environment. And so it goes back to, many people have typically got maybe over-provisioned. I can't tell you how many administrators I meet use their administrator ID with the high-level access that has been granted to them. They use it to get their email. It's the same account. Like, are you kidding? If you get that account compromised through a bad email, that's where you're going to get this security hole or attack surface, that identity now can be used across the entire enterprise as an attack surface. So now seeing all these different features, we can now see this chart makes a bit more sense. We can take a look across what it provides from a security perspective through those black boxes in the middle. We can take a look at the types of methods for getting this advanced enforcement of authentication protocols. And just focusing on that right-hand side, it's available as the primary method to authenticate. But you can also then use it as a secondary authentication. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about what's called a conditional access. Because now a term that's not used in the book, but we often talk about identity is the new perimeter of security. So no longer can you build bastion walls around your network or around your data center and use that as the perimeter of security to keep people out. Identities become that perimeter of security because Bob, as a user on a secure device, accessing a secure network from a secure location to gain access to secure information is a completely different persona than Bob on his work device in a non-secure location trying to access that secure data. And so we're going to show you this feature called conditional access. It says, hey, Bob, it's great that you've left your laptop open at the coffee shop and you've been authenticated, but someone's now trying to access some secure data. I'm going to ask you to use multi-factor authentication or give me a Windows hello. Look at this before I open up this document. Because in the past, once I authenticated, somebody could walk up to my laptop and use it if it was available, not locked. They could use it for anything because you've been authenticated. So now they're going to say, before I give you access to that secure information, I want to validate your facial recognition feature. So you're seeing that down the far right-hand side. So the secondary features available for MFA. And then you're also seeing that one that I've mentioned, SSPR, or self-service password reset. Here's the page that talks about the management groups. I'm not going to drain this slide, but management groups are a way for you to build at the top level of the scopes below your tenant. You can have the organizational structure that meets the requirements from a governance perspective to, do I have different divisions of my company? Maybe there are different geographic regions that might have different requirements. For example, in Europe, you've got GDPR for your personal use information, where in North America, you might have HIPAA regulations. Like I might need to have two different tenants for that possibly. Or do I have it in one tenant and put them in two different management groups and then have information flow down from there? So the big thing here is you've got 10,000 management groups across 6 different levels. It would be hard pressed for an organization to ask me to build an organizational structure that I couldn't be able to replicate by doing that using the management groups. Lots of features that you have around the management groups, from renaming them and moving things around. But again, we're not going to teach you how to do that necessarily, but know that it becomes one of the scopes from a security perspective, because as you build below the management group, subscriptions, and then the resource groups, you can have permissions that are set at a management group that get inherited by the child objects in the tree below that branch that you've been working with. RBAC, or the role-based access control that we've mentioned, I'm just going to do a whiteboard for just a second to explain this to you, but that becomes the way to assign identities to a thing called a role and the role to a scope to get the resource access control that you're working with. So let me just go do this as a whiteboard exercise. So role-based access control, or RBAC, has been around for a while, and it's a way for us to assign identities to roles. Roles become either built-in or custom. Identities are, as I said, users, devices, groups, and we have a whole new set of identities that we're going to take a look at that get into things like the security identities, where you get into system assigned managed identity or user assigned managed identities. So we got a whole new set of identities that we work with. So you take, in my case, I'm going to use a group, you assign it to a role that you then assign it to a scope. The scope becomes a management group, parent to child, to a subscription, to a resource group, to a resource. And so if I take a group and assign it a role, and I do it at the management group, you then get that information by default throughout the entire hierarchy. If I assign it to just a resource group, you would only inherit it down from there. So that's the RBAC principle, and those 3 bubbles I talk about of who, what, and where. So the who is a grouping of identities, the what is the role that you're working with, and the where becomes the scope. And through this process, you're going to be able to have that fine-grained control. And we're going to show you throughout the recordings in here that we actually have tools that will go off and monitor to make sure that people are using the roles that they were assigned. And maybe they've been over-provisioned. And so, you've given them read-write capabilities, but they only ever use read, but you've assigned them read-write. Wouldn't it be nice if, you only gave them, or you could deprecate them down to the only permissions that they're working with. So we'll show you how this all plays in. And again, you can monitor that using the Microsoft Cloud Security benchmarks. Here's an example of some of the roles that we have available to us as built-in roles. There are literally hundreds of roles that are managed by Microsoft. That's the key of the built-in roles. Now, you can have custom roles that you build of your own. Now, I've got an organization that is a very secure place, and while they say thank you very much for Microsoft for adding or removing capabilities to the roles as you add and remove capabilities from Azure, but we can't have in our organization people automatically getting something. And so what they've done, they've actually copied every single one of our default roles, our built-in roles, and made copies of them. They made them custom. And when and only when they have gone through and audited the potential change to a group that is built in, only then will they add that capability to the groups that they then manage on their own. But it's an extra level of management, but it gives them an extra level of security. And all of this, as I said, can be controlled and managed and monitored based around your security requirements and the governance model that you want to enforce. I just want to talk a bit about, because it'll be mentioned throughout the course as well as other courses, you want to make sure you don't over-provision. And so, for example, you're seeing 3 roles there, and there's various versions of this role: owner or administrator, contributor, and reader. A reader can only read the object. They can consume it. They can have access to it, and they can, look at it, but they can't write it. They can't change the object itself. A contributor role has the capability of reading it, writing it, modifying it. They can do everything with it. They can delete it even if they wanted to. The thing that they can't do is they can't change the permissions on the object. And that's what distinguishes a contributor role from the owner or possibly the administrator role that has that capability of actually changing the permissions on it. Now, I've got, the administrator and owner roles just as blank, but you can have an Azure Storage Account owner. So you might have a special role that has, that granular control that you're the owner, but you can only do it to a storage account. But then it has to be assigned to the scope. So instead of being able to do it to every storage account, you have the permissions now to be able to manage a storage account at the scope of the subscription. So you can manage all the storage accounts for that subscription. And again, you want to add that to your monitoring and use using the Cloud Solution benchmark. So roles are an important part of that who, what, and where. And we're going to show you a number of different tools over a period of time in these recordings of how you can manage it. But specifically looking at permission management as an administrative tool inside of Azure that you can now manage and control through things like Azure policies that can be then controlled through Microsoft Defender for Cloud. We can now take our entire estate from a permission perspective and use this permission management tool to observe the usage of those permissions that have been assigned. And we want to make sure that people are not over-provisioned. As I said, one of the things that this tool can do is saying, hey, these users assigned to this group, the permission was given to them as a contributor role, so they can read it, but they can also write it and modify it. But every single one of them only reads from it. So why have you over-provisioned that? So this is the kind of thing that you can work with that permission management to make sure that you haven't over-provisioned the resources that people are using. Another component we take a look at, and this was one of the fundamental shifts that we had at the cloud level, is we shift to a zero trust model. And another term you'll hear is secure by default. In the on-premises world, especially in the early versions of Windows and Windows Server, everybody had full control. So anybody could do anything anywhere. It was like literally everybody, anyone. We then, in Windows Server 2008, we changed that to say authenticated users had full control. So at least now you had to authenticate to a domain controller or a workgroup environment to be able to get that full control, but still you could do everything. And only over time did we start to tighten this up. In Windows Server 2012 R2, we changed the default value on a share from everyone full control to everybody read. So again, we've learned over time, but we were trying to, tighten things up, but the horse was already out of the barn at that time. In Azure, we fundamentally changed that model. We started with the zero trust. Terms you'll hear is secure by default and trust but verify. And so what you want to do is have these features that you have to open them up. And you're seeing in the center of that diagram is a set of policies that you can now enforce to govern this environment to make sure that that zero trust model is not going to be broken by opening things up too much for individuals. And all of this can be then managed through a governance model. Now, we talked about ID protection earlier. That was things that you could do around the identity to protect the identity. I want you to have a multi-factor authentication. I want you to be able to reset your password every X number of days. Privileged identity management, or a term called PIM, is an elevated Entra ID capability that you need a license for. So you have to elevate from usually a P1 to a P2 license. And it's going to give you a whole bunch of capabilities. Privileged identity management says, hey, to be able to manage some of these features, so one of the ones they talk about, just-in-time privileges, you're going to be able to sit there and say, yes, I'm an administrator, but I'm only going to be an administrator when I need to become administrator. So for 9 hours a day or 8 hours a day when I'm sitting at my desk, if I'm not doing administrator stuff, I am technically possibly administrator, but I'm not at this moment. And so what you might have to do is request access to elevate temporarily to that administrator role so you can do that activity for a period of time, and then you have that role capability taken away from you. You're still an administrator, you just can't be doing it casually whenever you want. So you have to go through this very deliberate process that maybe needs someone else to approve that happens. So that's what they refer to as just-in-time privileges. We also have the capability to now go through group memberships and validating that, hey, people are in this group. Maybe you had a project group that was there for 6 or 7 months that people have been working on that project. And you would then put a time limit that says, these people need to be in this group for 6 months. And the 6 months goes by. And as opposed to just leaving them in the group, it says, hey, maybe self-attestation. Are you still needing access to this group? Yes. And then you're still in the group. And if you've left the company or you're no longer there, worst case is you might even be away on vacation and you miss that notification, you may get taken out of that group. You could get put back in. We won't get into that level. But what you now do is you can manage it either through self-attestation. Maybe the owner of the group says, yes, I still need these people, just to audit it to make sure that it's going through. Or maybe you need an approval that a person says, yes, I need to still be in it. And just you asking for it doesn't mean you get it. It has to go to someone else to approve that. So these are all features of the privileged identity management capabilities that we have available to you. There's a longer list of things here that we take a look at that you can do to manage the security and the settings that are assigned to a user identity to make sure that the attack surface that the identity presents is limited, and not only in scope of capability, but at the time or duration that they can work with this. Another one that they have there is the ability to have that time-limited capability. We talked about the just-in-time management. Great ways to be able to limit access to a user account so that it's not this attack surface that you have to be worried about over a period of time. So here's the access review capabilities to go back and make sure that not only do people have to have access or a membership in the group, but you can actually do access reviews of the permission management to make sure that people are using the right set of permissions that are needed to gain access to the resources that they're accessing. Taking a look at those access reviews, here's a chart that goes through and talks about all the different reviews that are available for you. And you can see what they have for, from a reviewer can be either self-attestation that just describes all the features we were talking about. But when we get into conditional access, and I've mentioned this earlier, conditional access says, Bob on a secure device in a secure location is different as a persona than Bob on a secure device in public access, public Wi-Fi. So you're seeing that these conditions are going to be met based around you can assign a specific condition to types of resources and how they need to be managed. And there's a broad range of features like, is it on a secure device? Is it domain joined? Has it been patched lately? Has it got a security vulnerability that you're working with? What was the authentication method that was used initially, and do we have to elevate that? Is the authentication, there's one for called suspicious travel. Like I logged in to a physical location in Seattle here, and then all of a sudden, minutes later, I'm logged into New York. That seems kind of weird. You know, it can technically happen if you're using VPNs and stuff, but like maybe that's a suspicious login. So now it's going to ask for more information for that login based around a suspicious login. And based around the middle of the slide, I can either grant access of the MFA, I can actually deny access, or request that you elevate your access to meet the requirements that we have for that conditional access component. I mentioned at the start of this about the governance plane being at the tenant level and how we saw that from management groups that fall below the tenant. You got that management group subscription level. We had that as our governance plane, but there are reasons why customers need more than one tenant. Now, if you wanted to now extend your scope of being able to manage multiple tenants, the Azure Lighthouse capability provides that service that extends your reach into a multi-tenanted environment. So now if you do have two tenants, and we've shown you that you can use those accounts across the two tenants, but I want the same governance plane that's put across the two of them, Azure Lighthouse will do that capability for you. So there's a whirlwind tour of identity management and access control capabilities that are available in Microsoft Entra ID that are available for you. And the key from this course perspective, all of these features that we've talked about are going to be able to be identified, controlled through services that are covered in other parts of this course, and more importantly, governed through either Windows Defender for Cloud or Microsoft Sentinel, the two major actors that are going to be used to manage this environment for us and keep us in our governance model safe and secure. So that's it for this recording. I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.